8,000 soldiers, frozen in formation for over 2,000 years. Everyone who has ever stood at the edge of these pits has been told the same story, that this is a bodyguard, an eternal army sculpted from clay, standing watch over the tomb of the man who built them. That story is wrong. Albert Lin just aimed some of the most advanced scanning equipment on Earth at the ground beneath this site, and what came back does not match the man they buried. It does not match the myth. It does not even match the direction the soldiers are supposedly guarding. Something else is down there, something older, deeper, and far more carefully hidden than the emperor's own resting place. And by the time you understand what the army was actually built to conceal, you will never look at a single one of those clay faces the same way again. Before we get into what those scans actually found, hit like and subscribe, because you are not going to want to miss where this goes. Every year, millions of people walk past these pits. They take their photos. They read the plaque. They leave, believing they understand what they just saw. They don't. Here is what most people are told. Over 2,000 years ago, the first emperor of a unified China ordered the construction of an underground army to protect him in the next life. 8,000 individual soldiers, each with a distinct face, arranged in battle formation, buried to guard their ruler for eternity. It's a clean story. It's the story on the postcards. And for decades, it was the story archaeologists themselves believed, because it was the only story anyone had evidence for. But evidence is a moving target. And Albert Lin didn't come to this site to confirm what everyone already assumed. He came with radar that reads through solid rock, lasers that map what's buried without ever breaking ground, and a level of government access that no outside researcher had ever been granted before. What he found doesn't support the postcard version of this place. The soldiers are real. The scale is real. But the thing at the center of this entire complex, the thing every wall, every trap, every ton of packed earth was built around, was never the emperor. It was something his own empire was never supposed to know existed. Think about that for a second. This is one of the most studied archaeological sites on the planet. Satellite surveys, ground excavation, 50 years of careful academic work. And it took a team using radar, built for reading hostile, unmapped terrain, to find the one thing at the heart of it all that doesn't fit the story we've been telling ourselves since 1974. That should tell you something before we even get into the details. When a story this old, this famous, and this thoroughly documented still has a gap in the middle of it, large enough to swallow the accepted timeline, that gap usually isn't an accident. Somebody built it that way on purpose, and somebody else has spent 2,000 years making sure it stayed that way. The army was never facing outward to keep threats away from him. It was facing outward to keep everyone from looking down. The story everyone knows. To understand what's wrong with the official version of this place, you first have to understand how thin that version actually is. Here's what's documented. In 1974, a group of farmers digging a well outside the city of Xi'an broke through into a chamber filled with shattered clay. What they'd found, without knowing it, was the outer edge of one of the largest buried military formations ever constructed, a complex that would eventually be linked to the mausoleum of the man who forged the first unified Chinese empire. The scale, once archaeologists began excavating, was staggering. Thousands of soldiers, horses, chariots, bronze weapons sharp enough to still hold an edge after 2 millennia in the ground. Every figure individually crafted, no two faces identical. A level of labor that historians still struggle to fully explain. The accepted theory formed quickly and made intuitive sense. An emperor obsessed with permanence had built himself a permanent army so that whatever waited for him after death, he would not face it unarmed. That theory held for 50 years, mostly because no one had the tools or the permission to test it properly. There's a detail that usually gets left out of the postcard version, and it matters here. Long before 1974, the land around this site already had a reputation among local farmers, not as a historical curiosity, as a place you didn't disturb. Stories passed down for generations warned that whatever lay beneath those fields wasn't meant to be found. When the well diggers finally broke through into that first pit, several of them later described their lives changing in ways that had nothing to do with fame or reward. Land was seized by the state. Health problems followed some of them for years, never explained to anyone's satisfaction. You can call that superstition, plenty of researchers do, but it's worth noting that the people who lived closest to this ground for the longest amount of time were the ones most convinced that something down there had been sealed away on purpose, long before anyone had a single piece of scientific equipment to back that feeling up. This is where Albert Lin enters the story. Lin isn't a typical archaeologist. His background is in engineering and remote sensing, reading landscapes the way a doctor reads a scan, looking for what's hidden beneath a surface that looks completely ordinary from above. He's used that skill set in some of the most sensitive environments in the field, locating buried structures and objects in terrain most researchers would consider unreadable. Work that has earned him recognition well beyond the borders of any one country. Getting him onto this site at all took years of negotiation. The airspace above the tomb complex has been effectively off-limits for decades. Drone flights were banned outright. Every scan required sign-off from multiple layers of government oversight, and even the researchers who had spent their careers on site were kept from seeing the complete picture. Different teams were given different pieces of the site deliberately so that no single group of outsiders ever held the whole map. Information here has always been compartmentalized, not by accident, but by design. How Lin's team finally secured access to areas no foreign investigator had ever been permitted to enter has never been fully explained publicly. What is clear is that once they arrived, the atmosphere on site was tense in a way that had nothing to do with normal archaeological caution. Uniformed officials monitored the team's movements at every stage. Equipment was inspected piece by piece before it was allowed near the pits. Every drone flight needed its own separate written approval, and every scan was conducted with someone standing directly behind the operator, watching the readout in real time. That level of control is not how you treat a well-understood historical site. That's how you treat something you're actively trying to keep contained. Lin later described standing at the center of the complex as feeling like standing in a space that wasn't built for the living. Not a figure of speech, but an observation about how few people in 2,000 years had ever been allowed to stand exactly where he was standing, with an instrument capable of seeing through the ground beneath his boots. And once those instruments started reading the earth beneath the soldiers, it became clear why access here, what the scans picked up. The tools Lin used work on a simple principle. Ground-penetrating radar sends pulses of energy into the earth. When those pulses hit something dense, a wall, a cavity, a shift in soil composition, they bounce back differently than they do through undisturbed ground. Layer those readings together, and you get something like an X-ray of the Earth itself. Shapes with no visible surface presence, mapped entirely from echoes. From the air, Lin's team used LIDAR, laser pulses, fired down at the landscape, capable of stripping away vegetation and topsoil in the resulting image to reveal structure buried far below. Lin became the first person ever permitted to fly this kind of equipment directly above the burial complex, turning airspace that had been closed for decades into the vantage point that finally let researchers see the site as a single connected system instead of a series of isolated pits. Before the readings even started, walking through the sealed sections of the complex was its own kind of disorienting experience. Some of the soldiers stood posed as though they were a half-second from drawing a weapon. Others held a stillness that felt, according to Lin, more unsettling than any aggressive posture could have. Nearby chambers held carriages with wheels still structurally sound after 2,000 years underground, stables with clay horses frozen mid-stride as if waiting for a rider who was never coming back, and tools left exactly where they'd been set down, as though whoever was using them had simply stepped away and never returned. Every space felt like a single moment, stretched across 2 millennia and left to stand. On the ground, the process was slower and more physical. Teams walked the radar units across the surface in careful, overlapping sweeps, reading the Earth dozens of feet below their boots, one pass at a time. Lin has said that watching the rows of silent soldiers from above while this was happening produced an unease that grew with every hour rather than fading with familiarity. It wasn't nerves, it was pattern recognition, the sense that the beauty of the sculptures above ground was doing a specific job, pulling the eye upward and outward, away from whatever the instruments were slowly uncovering beneath everyone's feet. The first thing the scans confirmed was scale. The complex extends dramatically farther than the sections open to the public. Walls with no match on any existing survey, chambers that don't appear on a single official map of the site, shafts plunging more than 100 feet straight down into the earth in places no historical record describes. The second thing the scans found was stranger. Scattered through the deeper layers were clusters of small, densely packed shapes, thousands of them, tightly grouped, distributed in patterns that didn't match the orderly grid of the soldier pits above. 2 theories emerged almost immediately among the researchers reviewing the data. The first theory, personal effects. Objects from the emperor's life, replicated or preserved for the next world, the kind of possessions a ruler obsessed with permanence would want close to him forever. The second theory was harder to sit with. Some of the researchers believed these clusters weren't objects at all, that the density and distribution matched something closer to human remains. Neither theory, on its own, explained what came next, because as the scans pushed deeper, the layout of the complex stopped resembling a tomb built to honor someone and started resembling something built to bury something. The soil disturbance wasn't uniform. It wasn't the slow, even compression you'd expect from 2,000 years of settling Earth. In places, it looked violent, fractured, displaced, consistent with sudden and forceful movement. Lin's team had come looking for the boundaries of a burial complex. What the ground was showing them looked, in places, like a crime scene. Forensic geologists who reviewed the data pointed to something specific in the soil layering, what they call struggle layers, ground that has been mixed and compressed by bodies in motion rather than settled gradually by the slow weight of time. In several locations, the readings also matched the profile of collapsed or deliberately sealed tunnels, passages that appeared to have been closed from the outside, while whatever was inside them was still moving. None of that matched the clean, ceremonial burial the popular story describes. It matched something closer to containment, and at the center of it, not beneath the emperor's presumed chamber, but off to one side, buried deeper and more deliberately than anything else on the site, was a structure that didn't fit the pattern of anything around it. The structure that doesn't belong most of the complex, once you understand its layout, tells a coherent story. Outer pits for the army, mid-level chambers for staff, animals, tools, a replicated version of a functioning court, buried to serve the emperor in the next life. But roughly at the geometric heart of the site, well below every layer historians expected to be the deepest point, Lin's radar picked up a chamber that broke every pattern the rest of the complex followed. It was older than the structures immediately around it, meaning it was built and sealed before large portions of the visible army above it were even finished. It was positioned off-center, not beneath the presumed location of the emperor's own sarcophagus, but adjacent to it, walled off separately with its own distinct sealing method. And it was buried deeper than anything else on the site, deeper than the treasure vaults the ancient records describe, deeper even than the mercury-lined model of the empire the old texts claim runs beneath the central palace floor. Whatever this chamber held, someone made the decision, early and deliberately, that it needed to be harder to reach than the emperor himself. The dimensions were also wrong for what you'd expect from a burial space built to honor someone. A tomb built for a person of status tends to be spacious, designed for grave goods, for ceremony, for a body laid out with room to spare. This chamber read more like a confinement cell than a resting place, narrow, low, built for containment rather than display. Whoever occupied it may not have been placed there only after death. When ground teams were eventually permitted to investigate the outer edge of this specific chamber, using minimally invasive methods that wouldn't compromise the seal, what they found inside reframed everything. Human remains, not scattered, not disorganized, arranged with the kind of care usually reserved for people of significant status, high-quality grave goods, fine material, the signature of someone who had been powerful in life. Analysis of the skeletal structure suggested a young adult, likely in their early 20s, with stress markers in the bone, consistent with a prolonged period of hardship before death, the kind of markers you'd expect from someone held under difficult conditions for weeks or months, not someone who died quickly and was buried with ceremony immediately after. But the remains weren't alone, and they weren't undisturbed. Around this central set of remains, additional voids of similar shape and depth were mapped nearby, spaced at intervals, all sharing the same unusual signature: older construction, deliberate concealment, positioning that placed them beneath and outside the primary burial layout rather than inside it. Whoever planned this section of the complex wasn't burying one person in isolation. They were burying a pattern. Historical accounts from the period after the first emperor's death describe a violent and largely undocumented purge. The emperor's successor consolidated power quickly and, according to surviving fragments of record, moved to eliminate anyone who might challenge his claim to the throne, including, according to some accounts, his own siblings. Names appear in the official record and then simply stop. No account of exile, No account of death, just silence where a documented life used to be. The chamber structure the scans revealed lines up with that silence almost exactly. There's a number worth sitting with here. Historical records place the total labor force conscripted to build this complex at roughly 700,000 people. For generations, the assumption was simple, that once the work was finished, those laborers went home. The scan data doesn't support that assumption cleanly. If even a fraction of that workforce never left the site, the ground beneath the soldiers isn't just concealing a purged bloodline. It's one of the largest unmarked mass burial sites in human history, and the army above it has spent 2,000 years quietly standing guard over both secrets at once. The workers who built the place and the family members who were erased from it after the emperor died. This is the pivot point of everything Lin's team found. The complex the world has spent 50 years calling the Emperor's Tomb was never built with a single purpose. Somewhere in its construction, it became something else, a place engineered not just to honor one ruler, but to permanently erase the evidence of what happened to the people standing in the way of the throne after he was gone. And that reframes the 8,000 soldiers entirely. They aren't standing guard over a king. They're standing on top of a cover-up. The machinery of silence. Once you start looking at the rest of the complex through this lens, details that seemed incidental start looking intentional. Sealed chambers near the primary burial site have, in past excavations, yielded fragile written records, bamboo scrolls preserved only because they were sealed away from air and light for 2,000 years, requiring painstaking, climate-controlled work just to open without destroying them. Researchers working on these fragments had to hold temperature and humidity within tolerances measured in fractions of a degree, because exposure to the wrong conditions for even a few minutes could turn 2 millennia of preserved text into dust. Opening them properly took weeks, not days. What surviving fragments of these records describe isn't a triumphant account of a glorious reign. It reads, in long stretches, like a ledger of suppression. One passage records an order to bury hundreds of scholars alive, not executed quickly, but buried, for the offense of holding philosophical and historical ideas the throne hadn't sanctioned, ideas that implied there might be more than one legitimate way to organize a society. Other sections describe the systematic burning of texts across the empire, and not just political writing, history, philosophy, medicine, anything that gave a person a framework for questioning where the emperor's authority actually came from. Confessions appear in the record too, signed statements from builders and engineers who worked on the tomb complex itself, accused of everything from insufficient speed to simply associating with the wrong person. Reading the charges is uncomfortable even now, because so many of them amount to nothing more than proximity. A colleague under suspicion, a conversation overheard, an idea expressed carelessly in the wrong company. Once signed, those confessions didn't lead to release. The people who signed them became part of the site they'd built. Every layer of this project, in other words, ran on the same logic. Anyone close enough to see too much became a liability, and liabilities didn't leave. One wrong word, one hesitation someone else noticed, one accusation from a person with something to gain. And a worker became part of the foundation instead of someone who'd helped build it. There's a second, stranger thread running through these fragments too, accounts of the emperor's decades-long search for a way to defeat death outright, not just prepare for it. Expeditions were sent out across the known world in search of a legendary elixir. Entire fleets, carrying thousands of young men and women, were dispatched to find it and never returned. The convenient explanation is that they were lost at sea. The less convenient explanation, favored by some historians, is that a fleet returning empty-handed would have forced the emperor to admit publicly that he was mortal after all, and that admission may have been more dangerous to make than the ocean itself. That logic explains the isolated chamber Lin's team found far better than any theory involving the emperor's own remains does. It also explains why the site was engineered with defenses that go well beyond what you'd need to protect a body. Ancient accounts, long treated as exaggeration, describe mechanical crossbow traps built into the tomb's access tunnels, designed to fire automatically on anyone entering without authorization. Most historians assumed the wooden trigger mechanisms would have rotted away millennia ago. Bronze components, however, don't degrade the same way. Lin's scans picked up metallic signatures in exactly the locations the old texts describe, sitting quietly in passageways that haven't been disturbed since they were sealed. And running beneath the central structure, soil sampling around the mound has repeatedly returned mercury concentrations hundreds of times higher than anything that occurs naturally. Physical confirmation of ancient descriptions of rivers of liquid mercury engineered to flow endlessly through a miniature model of the empire sealed inside the earth. For a long time, these accounts were filed away as legend, the kind of detail that grows more elaborate with every generation of retelling. The soil data says otherwise. The core of the story checks out. That has real consequences for anyone who might eventually try to open this place. If the main chamber were breached, the pressurized environment that's been building inside it for 2,000 years would vent outward almost instantly, and mercury vapor, at the concentrations the readings suggest, is lethal within minutes at exposure levels far lower than what's indicated here. There's also a precedent for what happens to what's inside once air gets back in. When a smaller, subsidiary pit was opened decades ago, researchers watched painted pigment on the clay figures, colors preserved perfectly for 2,000 years, begin flaking away within seconds of contact with open air, an irreversible reaction triggered by the sudden change in pressure and humidity. If the central chamber contains anything organic, wood, silk, painted surfaces, the moment it's opened could be the same moment it's destroyed. None of that was necessary to bury one man with dignity. It was necessary to make absolutely certain that whatever this complex was really protecting stayed protected, sealed behind toxic vapor, mechanical traps, and hundreds of feet of packed earth, layered so deep that even the researchers who've spent their careers on this site never had the full picture. The 8,000 soldiers above ground aren't the security system. They're the decoration on top of one. What the army was actually guarding. Strip away the postcard version of this place, and here's what Lin's data actually supports. This complex began as a monument to one man's obsession with permanence. That part of the popular story is true. But somewhere in its construction, possibly even after his death, it was repurposed. Sections of it became a burial ground for the thousands of laborers whose deaths were never recorded. Deeper sections became something closer to a mass grave for a purged royal bloodline, silenced the moment they became inconvenient to the next ruler's grip on power. And at the absolute center, buried deeper, sealed more carefully, and hidden more deliberately than the emperor's own presumed resting place, sits evidence of exactly how that power was taken and kept. The soldiers weren't placed there to keep enemies out of the emperor's afterlife. They were placed there to keep the truth from ever climbing back out. Lin has said that once the scale of what the scans were showing became clear, the way he saw the site itself changed. He described watching researchers read fragments of the recovered texts aloud inside the complex and feeling the soldiers around him shift in meaning as he listened. They stopped looking like an honor guard. They stopped being, in his words, symbols of military power or the skill of ancient craftsmen. They became what they had probably always actually been: a permanent garrison standing in formation above a place built on suffering and enforced silence, keeping watch to make sure the suffering stayed buried. 2,000 years later, it's still working. The central chamber remains sealed. The mercury readings alone make opening it, by conventional means, close to unthinkable, and the deeper structure Lin identified has not been physically entered, only mapped from the outside, through solid rock, by instruments that can see but not touch. There's also a detail from the LiDAR surveys that hasn't been fully explained. Beneath the main mound, buried so completely it's invisible from the surface, the scans picked up a compact pyramid-shaped structure of densely packed earth, a shape with no match anywhere else on the site, positioned as though whatever it protects was considered more important than everything built around it. Some researchers believe it may correspond to the treasure chamber described in the old texts, a space said to hold gold and jewels on a scale the ancient writers struggled to put into words. Others aren't convinced it's treasure at all, a structure buried that deliberately, that deep, and that separately from everything else on this site could just as easily be protecting information as it could be protecting gold. Nobody currently has a way to find out which one it is without opening a chamber that 2,000 years of mercury, traps, and packed earth were specifically engineered to keep shut. Which means the most important question this investigation raises doesn't have an answer yet. We now know, with more confidence than at any point in the last 50 years, what the Terracotta Army was really built to protect. We still don't know exactly what happens the day someone finally opens it. The soldiers were never facing outward to keep threats away from him. Now you know why they were really placed there. And it wasn't for the man everyone assumes is still lying at the center of all that clay. If this changed the way you look at one of the most photographed sites on Earth, that's the entire point of stories like this one. History isn't always written by the people who lived it. Sometimes it's buried quite literally by the people who survived it, and left for someone 2,000 years later to dig back up with tools the original builders could never have imagined. What Lin's scans prove, more than anything else, is that the story we've been telling about this place for 50 years was never wrong because people were lying about it. It was wrong because nobody had looked deep enough to know there was more to find. That's usually how the biggest cover-ups survive, not through perfect secrecy, but through everyone assuming the visible answer is the whole answer. So here's the question worth sitting with. If the deepest chamber on that site isn't the emperor's tomb at all, would you actually want to see what's inside it? Let me know what you think it is. And if this is the kind of history you want more of, you already know what to do.